Good morning, everybody. We are excited to have Rob Bilott here. Welcome, Rob.
Thank
Thanks for
you.
being here. Everybody should know that Rob is a Less Cancer board member and has been a critical leader, not only for our organization, but for so many communities here across America and around the globe. You've done extraordinary things. Just to catch our audience up so they know, you are the subject of a movie called Dark Waters and the author of a book called Exposure. Um, can you, just for those two or three people that may not know, can you tell us a little bit about your journey? I know, a few years back, I think was it 2018 or 2019 when that New York Times story came out? When was that?
2016.
Really?
2016.
Yikes. Okay. So time does fly.
Time
So,
flies. Yeah.
so, you really caught a lot of attention when that story came out about being DuPont's worst nightmare. And the subtitle should have been, and everybody else's friend, right? So,
I
so we're
appreciate
so grateful for everything that you've done to raise the flag on this PFAS, PFOS issue. And I'm just wondering, to catch those people up, this all started because of Mr. Tennant, who
it.
was a farmer that reached out to you. Can you catch us up a little bit on that?
Sure. I've been an attorney now for, over 31 years. Started back in 1990. And pretty much what I was doing, I was working for a big corporate law firm called Taft. I'm still there after 31 years. A lot of what I was doing was representing big companies, trying to help them navigate federal, state, environmental laws, pretty complicated area. In 1998, I got a call from a gentleman in West Virginia who identified himself as Mr. Tennant, Earl Tennant, and he was raising cows and outside of Parkersburg, West Virginia. And he was desperately trying to find out why these animals were all getting sick and dropping dead. He could see white foaming water coming out of a nearby landfill owned by the DuPont Chemical Company. And it seemed pretty obvious to him, there's something in this white foam that's killing these animals. They were getting sick. They were having calves with birth defects or stillborn. The animals' teeth were turning black. They were developing tumors. They were wasting away no matter how much you fed them. And it wasn't just the cows, it was the deer, the fish, the wildlife in the area. But he wasn't able to help to find anybody to give him answers, either at the state EPA, the federal EPA, the company. So he was reaching out through, frankly, a friend of our family. His neighbor happened to be good friends with my grandmother. My mom's whole family had grown up in Parkersburg. So when I heard this gentleman calling me from Parkersburg, I knew that town well, and I thought, this should be something we should be able to help him out with. Seemed pretty straightforward. Here is a landfill regulated by the state of West Virginia that should have permits. It should list everything that's hazardous or toxic, and there's probably something being emitted a little too high above the permit limits. It's the kind of thing I help do. I help companies get permits to run landfills like this. So I thought it'd be fairly straightforward. So when he showed up in our offices, showed us all these videotapes and photographs, it was pretty obvious. You could see the white foam coming into the water. He'd cut into these animals. Those people who've seen the movie Dark Waters or the documentary The Devil We Know, those are the actual videotapes. You see in the film of what he saw inside these animals.
And I do want to stop you just for 1 second,
Yeah.
because those that are here, I really think it's important that everybody read the book and watch the movie. And if they can we just quickly share where we can find that movie now?
Sure.
Where is that movie now?
Dark Waters. Actually, it just opened in Japan. Because of the pandemic, things got kind of delayed and slowed down. It opened in the U.S. in 2019. You can find it now on Amazon, on Showtime. I believe it's still running as well. The Devil We Know documentary, I believe, is still on Netflix. Mm-hmm. So you can find them online still, and you can still find the DVDs.
Well, it wasn't all that long ago, and it's such a great movie. I cannot tell people enough to watch it or read the book. The book is incredible too, and I know that we've distributed it to several people as well. We really, it's such an incredible story. But I'm sorry,
That's all right.
I didn't want to lose that thought. I wanted people to make sure that they were tuned into this story. Go ahead and return to Mr. Tennant, West Virginia.
Sure. So Mr. Tennant had shown us all this, what was happening to these animals. I thought we could help him out. Seemed straightforward. So I agreed to take his case on. This is back in 1998. And that led to us discovering that there was a chemical in the water that was coming out of this landfill that was in the white foam, something we had never heard of at the time. Led to decades of litigation and discovery and collecting documents from not only DuPont, but the 3M company who manufactured this chemical and was selling it to DuPont. And we found out this was this completely man-made chemical called PFOA that was used in making Teflon, characterized by carbons attached to fluorine, 8 carbons attached to fluorine, which is why they called it C8. These man-made chemicals, this was not the only one. PFOA, there were a whole bunch of them that were being manufactured. This one was being used by DuPont down in West Virginia, a related one being used by 3M in making things like Scotchgard and firefighting foams. And these chemicals had been invented right after World War II, never existed on the planet prior to World War II, and had been pumped out into an incredible array of products, not just what we were seeing down in West Virginia. The plant that the DuPont owned there was making Teflon, but these chemicals were being used in all kinds of products: stain-resistant, waterproof clothing and carpeting, fast food wrappers, packaging, cosmetics, you name it. So we started digging into all these documents and realizing these chemicals had been used in massive quantities since the 50s, but essentially had been unregulated. They had predated a lot of the US chemical laws and regulations that really came out decades later in the late 1970s. So digging through all these documents through litigation, through a lawsuit that we brought for Mr. Tennant against DuPont to try to figure out what was happening at this landfill, led to us uncovering all these internal documents that told us these chemicals even existed and how toxic they were. And what we were seeing was that these chemicals, once they got out into the environment, this man-made chemical structure never broke down. They would stay there virtually forever, which is we now call them forever chemicals. They didn't break down. And if they got into living things, they caused all kinds of toxic effects, and they would stay in living things. They persisted. And they would get into humans who were exposed, and they would get in and stay to our blood.
Question about the persistence in that. I know, with some of those chemicals, are they still, like in the water, are they still alive in the fats, possibly, of the fish of the next generation? Is there an epigenetic piece to this that gets passed on? Do you know that?
Yeah, unfortunately, what we see is these chemicals, when they get into living things really can't break them down. Mm-hmm. They don't know how to handle them. So they stay in, and they tend to accumulate in the blood. They actually then they'll circulate throughout the body and coat all these different organ systems. And what scientists have been finding out lately is not only do they stay in living things, but they can actually get passed on. They can bioaccumulate as well. So we're seeing all this in these documents that I'm going through back in the early 2000s and realizing these chemicals are incredibly toxic. They're persistent. They bioaccumulate. And one of the things that was really the most striking was we saw that the companies that were making and handling these chemicals, 3M and DuPont at the time primarily, they had done cancer studies. They had actually tested the chemicals to see if they could cause cancer, and had determined as early as 1988 that exposure to PFOA, the chemical used in making nonstick cookware and all these other products, causes testicular tumors in rats. Then a couple of years later, a second study where the scientists at the companies themselves confirmed the chemical causes not only testicular tumors, but pancreatic and liver tumors, a tumor triad. The company DuPont, their own scientists, as early as '88, looking at this data, said this chemical is a confirmed animal carcinogen, possible human carcinogen. And at that time, they weren't sure what the mechanism, how does this cause cancer? So their own scientists say, because of that, we have to presume it can cause cancer in humans. That's 1988. Yet we're seeing all of this in these internal documents. And we're also seeing that this chemical apparently was getting out into the local water supplies through the air emissions from the plant, through discharges into rivers, through sending things to landfills. So as we're discovering what was going on at this plant, we also saw that the company, to try to fix the drinking water problem, had dug up a ton of this material from pits around the property and dumped it into the landfill next to Mr. Tennant's property in the late 1980s. And that was what was causing the foam. And that was what was causing the foaming water that was coming onto his property. So we were able to resolve his case for the farmer once we figured that out. But we realized this stuff was likely in drinking water all around the community. And given the different products that these materials were used in, was likely all over the United States, but nobody knew about it because this was all internal data. And this is a animal carcinogen, possible human carcinogen. So I actually put a lot of this information together, sent it in a big package to the US EPA in March of 2001, kind of naively at the time thinking, surely the federal agencies are going to jump in and start regulating this chemical, making sure that if it's in water, it's cleaned up, and addressing if it's been disposed in sites all over the US. That was over 20 years ago. We are still waiting for the regulatory process to start. But through all this litigation, through all what we just described, we finally started getting this information out to regulators and to the scientific community in the early 2000s about the fact that this chemical even exists. It's toxic. It could be causing cancers. It has been an incredible journey since then to try to get that information out to the wider scientific community, to the public, to the regulators, to understand the health threat here. Mm-hmm. Because what we've realized, wasn't just in the water around West Virginia. This stuff, these chemicals, not only PFOA used in making Teflon, but the PFOS used in making firefighting foam and Scotchgard and all of these fast food wrappers and cosmetics and dental floss.
Are they in pesticides too? Are they in pesticides as well?
There's been some studies suggesting they might be. That's been found in containers in which pesticides have been shipped. For instance, like mosquito sprays that were shipped. There's been some recent discussion about that. But we've realized that these chemicals were used all over the country. And I have been working for the last 20 years to try to get that story out to the broader public. And it's been an incredible opportunity to have this story presented through a film, through Dark Waters, through documentary, The Devil We Know, in the book, Exposure, so that people are able to understand we have these man-made chemicals out there. And what we now know is they have been used in all of these different products. And it's been happening for 70 or 80 years. And over that period of time, not only have these chemicals gotten out into our drinking water, into our soil, into plants and animals, they've gotten into all of us. Recent blood sampling that's been going back now, almost 20 years, has been confirming that these chemicals, these man-made chemicals, which we now call PFAS, per and polyfluoroalkylated substances, we now know there's not just one or two of them. There's not just PFOA and PFOS. There are hundreds, if not thousands of these, all in this PFAS family. These chemicals are all over our environment. They're getting into our blood. Sampling has confirmed pretty much 98 to 99% of humans have these chemicals now in their blood. Babies are born with these chemicals in the blood. It's passed from mother to baby. And some of the most disturbing science that's been coming out after all these internal workers, the company studies were done, additional studies were done by independent scientists looking at what can this chemical actually do to people who are drinking it? Those independent scientists confirmed that PFOA can cause two different types of cancer, not only testicular cancer, which we saw in the animal studies going back to the 80s, but also kidney cancer and 4 or 5 other diseases. That data that's finally gotten out to the public has resulted in the US EPA finally starting to set drinking water guidelines for these chemicals. And just recently, the US EPA has announced that they are confirming PFOA is a likely human carcinogen. And because of that, scientists are saying that the levels of exposure, the levels that are acceptable in drinking water may now be essentially 0. So when you think about this, here's a chemical that's gotten out into our drinking water all over the United States, all over the world. It's not just here in the US, it's being found in drinking water all over the planet. This chemical that gets into our blood is a likely human carcinogen. It is being now potentially linked with also impairing our immune systems and possibly decreasing effectiveness of vaccines. Well, here we are, the entire world is dealing with a worldwide pandemic. We have these man-made chemicals that can decrease our immune system function, decrease the effectiveness of vaccine, and likely human carcinogen. We need to be talking about this. And that's one of the reasons I was happy to be able to participate today and the incredible work that Less Cancer is doing to help educate people about where are they potentially being exposed to carcinogens like this, where we can reduce our exposures, if we can try to avoid the products where these chemicals have been used. And that's not always easy because there hasn't been a lot of information available to the public about where these chemicals have actually been used and what products. But that information's slowly getting out now. People are finally becoming aware of how they can hopefully minimize their exposure to these chemicals going forward.
Wow. It's really just blows my mind. And this is an issue that I've been reading up on for years and years and years, but every time we talk to you, there's something new. And you have really shed such a critical light on this. I wanted, I have a million questions, but I'm from Michigan, the Great Lakes state, and I want to talk a little bit about the Great Lakes because some of these legislation pieces that we've had from Representatives Upton and Dingell are doing things to help eradicate what's going on there. Can you tell us a little bit about Michigan? We've seen bans on some fish, or not bans, but warnings and some other things. Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on there?
Yeah. As this information has finally started to make its way out to the public, to the scientific community, to regulators, though, when the scientists start looking at this data about what these chemicals can do, the wide range of effects they can have, not only on human health, but on the environment as well, and on living things like fish and wildlife and plant life. What we've seen happen, particularly over the last just year or two, as that information is finally starting to get out, regulators have been really starting to focus on these chemicals and try to take steps to find out how widespread is the contamination. What can we do to try to minimize this contamination and minimize people's exposure? States in particular have been starting to move forward on their own because of this very slow federal process we talked about. Remember, we first asked the US EPA to set drinking water standards and to act on these chemicals in 2001. We're still waiting. It's looking likely that that's now finally going to happen, but it hasn't happened yet. So we have had states that have said, we don't want to wait. We want to move forward now and take steps to protect people. Michigan has been one of those states that has put together a task force to try to figure out how do we grapple this issue. They have done comprehensive sampling throughout the state of drinking water supplies and trying to figure out where's the contamination coming from, so at least we can stop those ongoing exposures. They've also tried to identify places where wildlife has been impacted, particularly, like fish, for example. Minnesota is doing this as well. New Jersey, Other states are also focusing on the potential for this stuff to get into fish and issuing fish advisories,
Right.
hunting advisories for deer, things of that nature. There was just a great article in the Washington Post, I think it was just a couple days ago, focusing on the impact that something like this has, for example, on indigenous tribes. Folks that rely upon the fish from the Great Lakes, for not only food, but their whole culture, their way of life. And so the extent of this contamination and the magnitude of its impact is really something we're just now starting to recognize.
Well, and we talk, or you talked about newborns, mothers, babies being born and pre-polluted. When we talk about some of these indigenous communities where fish is high on the menu, it's what they eat every day. They live in these communities where they have access to fish. And then, mothers are breastfeeding. And when I think people are really missing how generational and expansive this is. So it's not one fish you catch that just by chance happens to have these chemicals in it. It's all of them. And when we're eating them and eating a lot of them, and then passing it on our children through things like breast milk, it's a problem.
Yeah.
So are there any strategies going on now with protecting those communities that you're aware of beyond the water? Are there warnings going out? Can you share anything about that you might know?
To date, I think most of what's been happening is really trying to make sure that the most obvious source of exposure, drinking water, is being addressed. And so what we've seen is a lot of focus on just identifying where is the contamination. The sampling that's been going on across the country to try to find out, is it in our drinking water here? Or what about over there? And then steps being taken to stop that. What we're starting to see happen now is, now that we've pretty much realized drinking water is something that needs to be addressed, we see scientists and regulators trying to identify what are the other potential sources of exposure. How else is this getting into all of us? How is it getting into babies, before they're even born? And so what we see happening is a lot of work that's been going on to try to identify different types of products, different types of consumer goods that these chemicals have been used in, to try to figure out, are there other ways that we're being exposed that we may have missed, that we can be doing something about? That's why you've seen a lot of research that's come out just in the last year, identifying the fact that these chemicals, for example, are widespread in the use in cosmetics, things that are considered waterproof, or they're in building materials. Or you see, a lot of discussion about the fact that these chemicals have historically been used not only in the firefighting foam that firefighters have used over the years, not realizing the foam contained these chemicals, but possibly also in the coatings of the gear, the turnout gear that they've been wearing, the stain resistant or waterproof coatings in the past. And the fact that those, these are communities that use this gear for many, many years. So it's incredibly expensive. And this stuff starts to break down over time. There's been some great work done University of Notre Dame by Dr. Graham Peasley, trying to help identify whether these might be additional sources of exposure, because you're dealing with a community, firefighters, that already are aware that they've got elevated cancer rates and are trying to understand why. Where's that coming from? This may be another potential source. So I think we're going to see that continue over the next several years, at least, more and more understanding of the incredible broad range of products that had these chemicals or have had them in the past that we didn't know. We had no idea. And, it's so important for that information to come out, because that's the only way people can start taking steps to protect themselves. If we don't know the products had these stuff, we don't know to avoid them. So there's been a great work by a lot of companies coming forward and publicly announcing, we will no longer use these chemicals in our products. So at least people know they've got an alternative.
Thanks to you. Really, thanks so much to you.
Well, I appreciate that. And, there's a lot of groups that are doing incredible work, not only through, obviously with less cancer, trying to publicize this, other groups as well, trying to help bring attention to companies that are moving away from these chemicals. And that's why having discussions like this, having forums where people can discuss these issues is so important, because the information is just not all that readily available to the general public.
Well, before we close out here, I want to thank you for all you do. So many families I hear from where loss is part of their life, and you've identified something that gives us an opportunity to tap down on that suffering and to reduce that suffering that cancer brings. And I personally am so grateful for you. We hear every day from people that are so grateful for your work, and I just cannot thank you enough. If there is one thing that somebody could do at home to make sure that their drinking water is okay, can they get it tested, and can they have it filtered? Those are just two quick questions I want to ask before we fold.
Yeah, thanks so much, Bill. And again, thanks for what you're doing to help raise awareness on all these issues. But yes, if somebody's concerned about their water, there's an incredible database that's posted online by the Environmental Working Group that contains a lot of great information about about which systems have been tested, what the results are, or you can contact your water supplier, or folks that are on private wells. You may, of course, not have had it tested by somebody else, but there are ways to do that testing. Unfortunately, it still tends to be fairly expensive, but it can be done.
Are there any filters that people can put on their taps? Is there any way of filtering any of this out?
Yeah. Well, for those in public water systems, the most effective, of course, is to get filtration at the source. And a lot of them with public water supplies that are defining these chemicals now are dealing with putting in those types of treatment systems.
Thank you.
And there are a lot of companies now, I think, that are starting to market in-home filters, and how effective those are really varies by the company.
Hard to know.
Yep.
Well, we can't thank you enough, and thank you for being here today. I'm glad to see you looking so well. Again, the movie is Dark Waters. The book is Exposure. They're both so powerful. They're such powerful stories. I cannot recommend enough that people try to get their hands on the movie and the book both. They're incredible. Thank you for all your good work. We're so proud to have you working with us, and grateful. Thanks very much, Rob.
Thanks so much, Bill. It's an honor to be part of the Less Cancer organization. Thank you.